Morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Billy.
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning,
Sorry.
all. We are just giving a few minutes to people to join in. Here we have more people. It's a cold morning here in Belfast.
Very wet morning in Ballymena. Very wet.
Indeed.
Not nice.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yep.
Yes, Tiziana, I can see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
Is that Aiden? Hello, Aiden.
Hi, Tiziana. How are you?
Good. It's kind of strange to see you all in these little screens. Okay, why we don't start? And we will, oh, sorry. We have more people joining in, sorry. $12:05, so I will say good morning all. My name is Tiziana O'Hara, and I work for Co-operative Alternatives. We are the organizers of this webinar. So welcome. And please note that this is a recorded session. So if you don't want to appear on the screen, please take your camera off for the duration of the webinar. Well, we named this series the Transformational Power of Cooperatives. And this is a series that we started in September thanks to the funding of the Belfast City Council and also the Hive, that is a project sponsored by Cooperatives UK. In September, we look at cooperatives and local economy. Then we went to look at cooperatives in energy. And today we will look at workers' cooperatives. The series has 5 seminars and it's about what cooperatives can offer and how we can support their development in Northern Ireland. Cooperatives, we know, are a vehicle for transforming local economy development, a business model that allows people and communities to meet their needs and aspirations. Cooperatives, we believe, are actually offering a unique answer to contemporary problems. And a space where solidarity and mutual aid are valued, and where economic pursuits are embedded within consideration for the communities and the planet in which we live. The webinars are for anyone involved in economic and community development, and for people interested in hearing first-hand experience for new emerging co-ops in Northern Ireland and beyond. We welcome everybody, but policymakers and government and council officials in particular, because if you are involved in economic development, regeneration and business support, I think you can benefit very much from this webinar series. The series is also aimed to any activists and cooperators who may want to set up alternative models to answer the needs of their communities, their enterprises, all being inspired by local cooperators. So we are welcoming you to the next two events, if you are free to join us. One about social care, caring co-ops on the 10th of November, and community-led housing and housing co-ops at the end of November on the 24th. We also wanted to launch today our new series, the new series called the Cooperative Skill. Again, thanks to the Belfast City Council, the Economic Department, we are going to create a series which anyone involved in cooperatives or anyone thinking to set up their own cooperatives, they can learn from some practical examples on how to develop cooperative skills. Unfortunately, cooperative skills sometimes needs a bit of attention to run successful cooperatives. We will start in November, the 17th, with the cooperative journey from ideas to cooperatives, and we will end up on the 15th of December, just before Christmas, looking at community shares and loan stock offers. By the way, a great report on community share has been just launched today by Community Share Unit in England. And we are part of that beautiful story. But come today. Here we are today talking about workers and employee-owned cooperatives. Times are changing, we know that. COVID-19 has created maybe an unprecedented urgency to revalue and reassess how we live and we work. The concept of putting workers at the center and may dare say in charge of business is still unfamiliar, but we are now experiencing new interest for alternatives and new models. The webinar will introduce the advantages of workers' cooperatives and make you discover, I hope, through local case studies that workers' cooperatives have been operating here. Yes, in Northern Ireland, and they are a really excellent example. And Ellie Perrin has both a first-hand experience of them and currently writing a full PhD on them. After Ellie, we will hear from Andrew Harrison from Co-Ownership Solutions, a specialist organization in the field of employee ownership. Andrew, as a practitioner, will guide us through employee-owned models and the advantages of considering those in succession plans, with case studies across the UK. Employee-owned businesses keep wealth in local economies and fairly distribute them among the ones who actively work for it. So here is the agenda with the two excellent speakers that we will go in succession. And thank you for coming and joining us. Now, I would like also to ask the audience, the attendees, to keep their mic off during the presentation. But when it comes to the question and answer, please put your mics on and ask as many questions as you want. You can also use the chat facility if you want. Now I will stop sharing and stop share. I will check that everybody is okay. Yeah, ready to start. So welcome, Ellie. The floor is yours.
So much. I hope you can all hear me well and let me know if you have any issues. As Tiziana, well, first, thank you for having me, Tiziana, and for the introduction. So I'm doing a PhD in the University of Liverpool on worker cooperatives in the north of Ireland. And as Tiziana has mentioned, this is informed by former experience in a worker cooperative, which has led me to do 3 years of research now, qualitative research with interviews, with working alongside cooperatives as well, in around 10 projects. Some of the worker cooperatives are actually in the room today. I think, Danny, you've just joined us. Can you put your mic off because we can hear background noise? Danny Payne. Thanks. So I've worked with 10 projects, as I was saying, and some of them are in the room today. I think Alice is in from the cleaning co-op. So it's actually quite an honor to present, in front of the worker cooperatives themselves. It's their knowledge and their expertise that transpires in what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So I definitely hope to do them justice. And I think it highlights also the importance of doing qualitative research. What I mean by that is we tend to talk a lot about co-ops in terms of economic contribution. We talk about turnover. But here today, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm really going to talk about the everyday realities for the workers in those organizations. As a result, I'm going to use some of their quotes, participants' quotes, trying to keep it short. Obviously, it's not going to be as authentic with my accent. I hope you'll all forgive me. You'll have to be a bit imaginative with that. And I'm going to also, start now by talking about our economic system. I'm then going to talk about what worker cooperatives are, and then lead on to the research about cooperatives in the north of Ireland. I know there are some economists and Marxist theorists in the room, so this is going to be very much in layman's term. I apologize if I'm simplifying it, but please bear with me. So the reason why we're interested in worker co-ops is they're organized, they radically differ compared to the way we normally organize our economic activity. And that's what I kind of want to start on. In the economic system that we live in has changed dramatically over the last 100 years. I think we'll all agree on that. But there are some elements of it that actually have changed very little. And the way the enterprise is organized internally is one of that. So when we go to work, we produce goods and services, we create value through this process. But a significant proportion of what we create of that value, we do not appropriate, we do not get it back. Actually, it's shareholders, usually shareholders, that are entitled to make those decisions over profit, over what happens with that value. And that system is unfair and it's exploitative. Even a vast majority of people do not have a say over the decisions that affect them, over the economic decisions that affect them. So companies, shareholders make decisions on what to produce, on how to produce it, and on where to produce. Many of us, we live with the result of those decisions. If a company wants to relocate a car plant in a different country, we lose our jobs. If you're a supplier, you also lose probably your job if you're supplying that company. If the enterprise decides to discharge sewage in your river, this is your water, that's polluted. If they do not implement health and safety standards, it's your well-being that is impacted. And in fact, a lot of the issues that we're facing, whether it's economic crisis, climate change, social and economic inequalities, they relate to those very decisions being taken out of our hands. Democracy in work, most of the time, there is no democracy in that fundamental aspect of our life. Shareholders, they could be workers. It could be us, really. There's nothing against it, really. We could be running that organization. We could be running our workplaces, and we would have, therefore, control over what we produce. We would have control over where we produce, and we would have control about how we produce and where that profit goes. That can have quite a lot of implications because the workers, compared to the majority of distant shareholders, they live they play, they raise family in and around the site of work. For them, the cost of relocating a plant or the cost of climate change is much more important. It's much more immediate than for distant shareholders who are going to be able to shield themselves from these decisions. In worker cooperatives, compared to other enterprises, are much more egalitarian and they're much more ethical. To define worker cooperatives, they are jointly owned and democratically controlled by the workers. I think it's important here because I know Andrew after me will talk about employee ownership. I'm not just talking about ownership here. You know, I'm not talking about the joint US partnership. I'm talking about workers running the organization as well, having control over it. This is what I'm going to cover. Worker cooperatives, like any other co-op really, is governed by what you could call an international bill of rights, if you want. So we share values internationally, we share principles internationally, and those principles, they imbue our economic activities with ethical concerns. Concerns over independence, over redistributing profit, over inclusivity, solidarity, concerns for the wider community. But what is less known about worker cooperatives is how they're actually better businesses at doing business. Their economic performance has long been evidenced. In the UK, for example, worker cooperatives foster 35% more employment for every £1 of turnover compared to other enterprises. We know that they're more productive, they're more profitable, their survival rate in the first few years of business is higher, and there's international comparative studies on that. But it's not just about economic performance. There's also, they are happier organizations. There's higher levels of happiness, cohesion, trust. They alleviate poverty. There's loads of things that are really interesting about work we know internationally. In the north of Ireland, in Northern Ireland, you know, they've received very little attention. And I think it's actually the same in the rest, you know, in the UK and in the rest of Ireland. And we've done research this summer for Cooperatives Alternatives, trying to look at how many cooperatives are there in the north. And we found 214 cooperative societies. The majority of them are going to be credit unions. They're going to be agricultural co-op. And there's very few worker cooperatives. We find 7 that are still trading, potentially 8, as there's one that might be soon registered. So that's not a lot. And I think it's culturally, you don't find worker cooperatives as present here as you could see them in France, in Spain, or in Italy. And there's very little known about them, how they function, how they operate. So you could really say that worker cooperatives are an unfamiliar model here, which is I'm interested in doing research on them. Now, the research that I'm doing, I've focused on 10 projects overall, 10 worker cooperative projects. Some of them are no longer trading, or they're no longer trading as cooperatives. And I know this is quite marginal, you know, this is not a lot of organizations, but I think what they do is provide very interesting insights into everyday attempts at fostering dignity at work, into bridging the sectarian divide, into gender empowerment, in working in a more democratic and sustainable way. So I'm only going to cover 3 examples, but obviously 3 years of research, there's a lot more that we could talk about. But before I do that, I want to say it's not a rosy picture here. It's actually quite difficult. It's a hostile environment for worker cooperatives and actually for any cooperative. Some of them are no longer trading because of that hostile environment. They were forced to turn to companies. Some of them were in debt. They lacked investment. Opening a bank account is even a nightmare for a worker cooperative. So it's incredibly hard. It's an incredibly hard environment. And I wouldn't be doing justice to cooperators if I was not saying that. But for the cooperatives that survive that, I think the outcome can be transformative. And that's why we've talked about this webinar being about transforming work. So the first one is LoveWorks. LoveWorks is located in Duncan Gardens in North Belfast. It's an interface, so it's a peace line between Protestant Tiger Bay and Catholic New Lodge in North Belfast. Because I know you have some people who might not know that in the room today. And it was created in 2015 after a kind of series of grant project supported by the local church. And the project is very much about empowering young men in an environment that's dominated by unemployment, low education achievement, criminality, homelessness, also the legacy of the conflict. LoveWorks has 3 different activities. There's a garden landscaping and maintenance scheme, and a community garden now as well. They also have a bike shop and a bike repair service. And they're best known for an organic bakery where they sell sourdough bread and other treats. I think they now have a stall in Boundary Brewery, which is a craft co-op in East Belfast. And they also sell from the Macquarie Hall in North Belfast on Saturdays. So that's one example of a worker cooperative. The second worker cooperative, which is in the room today, so they'll be able to tell you more themselves, is the Belfast Cleaning Society. It was created in 2011, and interestingly, if you see with LoveWorks, it has a similar, there's a similar pattern here where it's located on the Cooperway interface in West Belfast, so between the Falls Road and the Shankly Road. And it was established after a series of anti-sectarianism training with groups of women from both sides of the Springfield Road interface, organized by Trademark. It's now 9 years old. It's a living wage organization, and it's actually been a living wage organization from the start. It won the Living Wage Award in 2016 ahead of, the likes of IKEA, which I think is quite important to mention. And the vast majority of workers are women, but from the last information I had, there were 14 workers employed through the cooperative. Both those cooperatives that I have mentioned have actually continued operating throughout the pandemic, which I think is also an important aspect. Now, the cleaning cooperative tries to also tackle the lack of employment, social deprivation in West Belfast, but there's also an idea of providing decent employment in an industry, the cleaning industry, that's rife with precarious working conditions, 0 hours contract, low pay. The last co-op that I'm going to talk about is Creative Workers. It was set up again in 2011 as well. It's quite a small, 3-member team, although they've hired more employees recently, that provides design, photography, film, coding, so website development. And I think for them, the cooperative, they're actually also located on the Cooperway interface. They joined, they're sharing the office with Trademark and with the Cleaning Society now, which I think is also creates an interesting hub for worker cooperatives in West Belfast at the moment. And they use the cooperative to create a structure so that they could make a living out of their passion, make a living out of creative work. Because a lot of the time working in the creative industry either implies very low wages and very long hours, or it implies working in completely unrelated industries, hospitality, usually to try and make a living, because there's, it's not easy accessing those jobs. Out of all of the co-ops, it's probably the most outward looking one, where it's not simply about workers directing the enterprise for themselves and by themselves. They very much want to bring other people in from the creative sectors. They want to build up a cooperative movement. They do work with community organizations, and I think they also want to advance left-wing progressive politics. Look at those 3 co-ops, we see 3 patterns, so I'm going to cover 3 topics that are emerging. The first one is about economic growth. So if you look at, they're all 3 actually living wage organizations, and within a few years of business, they've managed to be successful economically. And I think that reflects a focus on sustainability and resilience compared to maybe concept of exponential growth. But it also reflects a focus on employment, providing decent employment, especially for groups that might not otherwise have access to it. So whether you look at people who might have been homeless, who have criminal convictions, mothers who have therefore gaps in their employment history, there's really an attention to bring employment to marginalized groups here. And in all those, as soon as they kind of reach some form of sustainability, reaching a living wage, they would hire more employees. So creative workers cooperatives taking years actually to reach the living wage. And as soon as they did that, they hired two more employees, which I think shows that these are projects about solidarity. They also have strategies to safeguard jobs collectively. And I'll use, unlike other businesses, if so those businesses, if they lose the contracts, we don't want to see people getting sacked. We will bust our ass to get more contracts and more tenders and keep them employed. And I think it just shows that idea of safeguarding jobs collectively. Equal pay structures. There's no difference in pay. It's the same wage per hour, and profit is redistributed for the community. And for me, that's one of the most interesting aspects here, because the main criticism that's been made against worker cooperatives is that it's self-interest. It's the workers, but not the community. Can you all hear me? Sorry, I've had a message. Okay. So we have this idea that worker cooperatives degenerate, that they're all about the self-interest of the workers, that it's not about solidarity with the rest of the community. And actually, in all of the worker cooperatives that I have interviewed, even when profit was marginal, when there was very little of it, there was an intention to redistribute it. And that could be donate good to asylum seekers, organize community events, work with other cooperatives, sponsor local youth clubs, sports clubs. So you have that pattern there that really happens. And this room from the Cleaning Society said, we don't want to be millionaires. We want to help the community. And I think that's really important. Just talking about wages, what we see in those worker cooperatives is an attention to and work. They provide more than just a wage. They provide fulfillment. They provide pride, and especially work that's traditionally considered unskilled is revalued not through the wage, but also revalued through that pride. So there's an attention to what we call control over working conditions. It's secure employment. There's flexibility to work around other imperatives like raising a family. There's an impact on well-being and health, like using, for example, cleaning products that are not going to be having a detrimental impact on the workers' health. There's participation in the decision-making process.
Ellie, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
Can you double check your own microphone, if you don't mind?
Okay, I might take that off. Is that better? Okay, cool.
A little better. I think that's a little better.
Sorry to interrupt you. Please carry on.
Okay. So I was talking about, this dignity at work and dignity in work. And dignity at work is this control, over working conditions, the secure employment, the flexibility to work around raising a family. There's the impact on well-being and health. There's participation in the democratic process, decision over working hours. And for example, the Creative Workers Cooperative has only a 4-day week, so they kind of limit the hours they work. But there's also dignity in work. And dignity in work is how work can provide pride, how you gain skills, confidence, self-esteem, how you find work meaningful and fulfilling. And I have a quote from LoveWorks on this, where one of the participants, and he explains that a lot of the time you spend in work. And he said, if you can get your teeth into it, it's half of your life. The other half, you can just relax. You don't have to find somewhere else. And he's saying, I'm getting fucking turned on every day by working in a cooperative. I love it. And I think it shows that kind of fulfillment, that the fact that it's actually meaningful. There's an attention to also sharing skills. And those skills often in those cooperatives are self-taught. So you don't go to universities to learn those. It's a form of apprenticeship of the old, if you can say so. And they're developed in-house and they contribute to magnifying confidence. But one thing that I found really interesting is those non-hierarchical ways of working together, of collaborating. They create a sense of belonging. They create a culture of care. And a lot of the cooperators that I have talked to have mentioned what you could call therapeutic practices. So therapeutic practices from economic marginalization, from social disempowerment, but also experiences of addiction, violence, and crime, the legacy of the conflict. So you have worker cooperatives that provide a safe space, that provide genuine cross-community experiences in some cases. Sometimes underplay, when we talk about transforming work, we underplay the impact of that culture of care. And this is another quote from LoveWorks, who's someone who's changed his life, I think, through that cooperative. And he explains, because of the lifestyle that I've left behind, it's hard to put into words what LoveWorks means to me. It saved my life. It's a business, it's a co-op, but if it didn't exist, I would be dead. It's as easy as that. And I think that's a really powerful statement for a worker to make. But I've said that before, it's not easy, it's not rosy, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of difficulties, and especially we live in a society where we don't know how to work collaboratively, democratically. And as one member of the Creative Workers Cooperative says, a functioning worker-owned cooperative with real democracy, it's not comfortable at all. Actually, it's messy, it's heads in, it's doing something from the ground up with absolutely no support. You have to create something from scratch. It's not going to be handed to you. You have to quite literally take over buildings. And I think that shows you how difficult that may be. There's issues with responsibility. Responsibility is rewarding, but it also leads to a lot of sweat equity. And when we talk about sweat equity, we talk about that unpaid work, all of those hours spent trying to make sure that the business is surviving. But there's also a clear lack of education and sometimes linked to confidence. As I said, we don't work collaboratively. There's no education in schools on cooperation and cooperatives, and there is no experience of it in other workplaces. Of course, I know trade unions provide indirect democracy, but there's no experience of direct democracy. I'm gonna finish now on probably what I think is the most interesting aspect of it. Beyond just transforming work in workplaces, there's a very important aspect of worker cooperatives in the north of Ireland. And I'll start with a quote from Creative Workers, where one of the participants says, "There's no walls that goes up in any of the co-ops that I've come across." And there's this idea of really crossing the sectarian divide. A lot of those cooperatives are located in working class areas. They are located near interfaces. You've got this, as the result of Belfast geography, you've got this kind of link between social deprivation, but also the legacy, of trauma, of violence, of paramilitarism in some cases. So we go back to that idea of we decide where to produce. So you have businesses in those areas trying to open them up. And as one of the participants for Long Work said, it's about taking ownership of the street, of the geography. So it's not just about taking ownership, you would say in a Marxist sense, of the means of production. It's not just about the production, it's also about the geography beyond that, about the community around the workplace. And for me, it's important because at the moment, the strategies of local regeneration, in particular in Belfast, create that kind of twin speed city. You have strategies of normalization where traditional sectarian divisions are replaced by socio-economic divisions. So it's somehow unacceptable that kids go to different schools. It apparently costs too much, but it's become okay not to pay for free school meals. It's unacceptable to segregate housing on the basis of religion, but it's okay to segregate housing on the basis of class. This is the kind of normalization that we're seeing. Think about the role of socioeconomic inequalities, even in the onset of the conflict. You realize that this vision for economic recovery is not going to foster peace. It's not going to champion peace in the long term. And worker cooperatives provide completely different experiments in this regard. They offer what you could call a shared space, but a shared space that's truly inclusive because it engages with working class people. There's an attention to addressing gentrification. They're making products accessible, and sometimes there's a lot of discussions around that in those worker cooperatives. But they also confront the sectarian divide, and it's not sanitized. There's sensitive, complex conversations that happen, but they confront that sectarian divide with class-based solidarity, with creating common ground, taking ownership of local reconciliation and regeneration. For me, that's important. Common ground, that idea of shared space, of moving forward with solidarity. But when we talk about the inclusivity, it's not just about the divide in terms of orange and green politics, in terms of zero-sum game sectarian politics. It's also diversity in a much broader sense. They engage with groups for who the divide is not as important, asylum seekers, racism, sexism, disabilism. It goes beyond just that. There's some really interesting politics that are happening. And for me, it's powerful because it relates to the principles and values of cooperation that I've talked to initially, that Bill of Rights that's shared internationally on cooperation. And I'll finish, because I want to as much time as possible. So I'll finish now actually with a quote from a worker cooperatives that I haven't portrayed in this research called Halterish, in this presentation, sorry. It's an organic craft cooperative, a feminist cooperative, but also an Irish cooperative, obviously from the name. And the participant said, I suppose from a post-conflict society point of view, it's not just about the fact that we're not killing each other anymore. It has to be about more than that. And I think different models, less exploitative models, more interesting spaces, places, experiences, things done on a smaller scale, done well, I think that is much more viable in terms of breaking down barriers. And I think I'll end on that.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Thank you. I'm sure everybody is happy and ready to maybe ask some questions. I open the floor to any questions. So Karen, yeah, I can see one hand. Karen, do you want? No, it's not you. No. Anybody wants to ask any question? Okay, Billy and Michael. Okay, I see Michael has no mic. Okay, Billy first and Michael second. So can you ask your question? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tiziana. Thank you for that, Ellie. Ellie, you touched on an interesting point where volunteering and employee, where the two situations meet. And if there is a desire to create, what I can see and where we're going is there is a desire to create employment, but there also is a desire to volunteer. And it's an interesting debate about how that comes into the whole, you know, as we want to move away from what was seen as a purely social enterprise idea to a cooperative owned idea. It's how you balance that situation out with the fact that you want to create employment, but a lot of people who want to get involved in it don't want employment. They want to volunteer, but they still want to be part of a process. And I would be very interested to hear from your own experience how that works for you. You mentioned it during your comments there.
Thank you, William. Can I take another question from Michael? Then I have two other questions in line from Claes. Do I pronounce it properly? And Alice. So Michael, you go first, and then we stop and we let Ali answer, and then we do the other two. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both for the organizing and presenting to us this morning. I'm going to in terms of the point Ellie made at the start about the difficulties that people face in setting up cooperatives and the impact that that has on the growth of the cooperative movement in the 6 counties. What are the practical things that government, the assembly, or the executive could do to help facilitate the sector and help people come together and set up cooperatives? I mean, you mentioned the difficulties with setting up a bank account as one example, and the difficulties with getting an investment. Does she have ideas around how they could be addressed, or does anybody else, for that matter, have examples or ideas about how that could be, those problems could be addressed?
Thank you, Michael. Ellie, would you like to take these two first? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take these two first. Volunteering, it's an important debate. And actually, the worker cooperatives take different approaches to that. So most of them will think, I mean, volunteering is unpaid work, and unpaid work is unacceptable. I think that's the first thing to say, especially when it's not wanted. So are you putting people who in really, really difficult situation where they're doing this maybe in the hope to get a job, but I mean, how do you pay the rent? How do you put food on the table? I think it's, for me, there's something really problematic with it. And a lot of the worker cooperatives consider that problematic, and they will not accept volunteers. If they're not able to pay people, then it's just, that's not the point. Now you have one of the worker cooperatives that uses volunteering, but it's used in a very specific way. It's especially for members who are on the benefits, so have a lot of difficulties, and they're on the benefits. They stay on the benefit system and volunteer for a few years until they're able to jump, and to go into self-employment if there's enough of a wage. So that's one approach that's been taken, but there is discussions around that, and that even can be problematic. There's also, of course, volunteers, people who cannot earn a wage. So if you're thinking of someone who's an asylum seeker, for example, waiting for a response, you can't work. You basically are not allowed to work. So volunteering in an organization, and some of them do that in some of the worker cooperatives, then there's something positive about this, and I understand that. But generally speaking, it's how do you empower people without taking care of the material conditions of living? And while I said there's more to cooperatives than the wage, it's not just about the living wage, it's about pride, it's about skills, it's about all those things that could be achieved through volunteering. I think it doesn't mean you compromise on those material conditions. It doesn't mean you compromise on a wage, and it's trying to find that balance. So from a work cooperative point of view, I think a lot of them will say no, unless it's specific circumstances, will say no to volunteering. It's not something that they will try to promote. If that answers your question.
Sorry, Tiziana, for coming back in again. Maybe I'm not putting the point across right to you, Ellie. The volunteering, and I totally agree with every single thing you said there about you should not be allowed to hide behind volunteering and force people to volunteer. But the issue that I'm bringing to the table is that if you have guys who are people, sorry, be careful, who have at the end of their working life, who are in a position where they've recently been made redundant or have decided that they want to add something to community. Them same people may be in the position that they don't have to receive an income for their own financial position, very lucky position to be in, but they want to put something back into society, and down here in Tiziana knows them well, there's a lot of guys work for all their life in the tobacco industry and the tire industry, and them guys is looking for some to give something back again now. They're not necessarily, you don't want that to cost them money, but by the same context, they're not looking for income. What they're looking for is satisfaction. You talked about on their dignity there, you talked about fulfillment and satisfaction. Them guys is looking for that. Them people's looking for that. So when I'm asking that volunteering question, I am not in any way suggesting it's a cheap way to get labour. It's the fact is how you use and can harness their experience to disseminate their skill, to mentor their skills to people who's looking to get into employment.
Thank you, Billy. I think if you don't mind, Ellie, just quickly to wrap up, and I let you go on to the next question. But I think, Billy, there are different types of cooperatives. Workers' cooperatives. The main objective is to create work, but community cooperatives, as we know, are maybe to create a participation and democratic control on maybe what you're doing. So different model of cooperatives may answer different needs. I hope this addresses your question. But Michael's question was about what government can do, really. Ellie, do you have some kind of nice list of asks?
Well, there's a huge list of asks here, but and I didn't cover that in the presentation because I think I knew we were going to talk about that. At the moment, whether it's a worker cooperative or not, they're not operating on a level playing field. So that's the first thing to say, level the playing field for first. So there is, if you look at countries where there's a lot of worker cooperatives, where there's a cooperative economy that is thriving, you find that there is support, there is advice, there is financial support as well that's provided. And there's also what we call benevolent legislations. So you'll find that in France in particular, in Italy and in Spain, in Quebec as well, in a lot of areas. And in Northern Ireland, there's none of that. It's not a congenial environment. So we could ask for more education and awareness, because first of all, people don't know about worker cooperatives and cooperatives, and they should know about it. They should know about it in school. They should know about it in universities. When you talk about economics, you're not going to talk about cooperation. That's usually not mentioned. But we also need to ask for more practical advice. We need to ask for local development agencies to understand cooperatives and to help people who want to set up cooperatives. So that would be an ask. And one of the last things that we could have is we could have a cooperative development organization for the north of Ireland, the same way there used to be one. You have some in Scotland, in Wales, but there's none here. These are things that we could ask. I mean, the list is very long, and I know there are people doing that work at the moment. Cooperative Alternatives is an organization that helps cooperatives. Trademark as well is an organization that helps more specifically worker cooperatives at the moment. But they're doing this work in isolation, and they need to be supported. I think that's a very important part
Ellie,
of it.
Perfect, thank you. There are a couple of more questions, so they keep coming. And so let us go to Claes and then to Ali, and then we have another two. If you wanted to be succinct in your answer as well, and please, they also succinct in asking the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie, for a great presentation. I'll be very brief. You talk about the hostile environment that these worker co-ops find themselves in. Supposedly, one organization or one type of organization that would try to support worker co-ops would be trade unions. What do you find the relationship between trade unions and worker co-ops to be? How do they support worker co-ops, and could they do more?
Sorry, Ali, would you like to ask your question?
It's sort of not a question, but well done, Ellie, on your research. I'm sure you're glad to see it coming to the end of it. I just wanted to add that Trademark and Cooperative Alternatives have working for many, many years trying to help and support co-ops. The barriers that we face on a daily, weekly, monthly is unreal. And I'll give you a wee bit of an instance. Belfast Kingdom started 2012. HMRC did not know what a co-op was. The banks did not want us to open an account because they couldn't understand what a worker co-op. They kept asking who the boss was. When we told them all the workers were the boss, they were a wee bit confused. It took a lot of paperwork and a lot of chasing to be able to get a bank account open. Our customers know what a workers co-op is. So my point would be is education. People need to understand what a worker co-op is. They also need to understand that there is an alternative to the capitalist way, and to, invest in and all these business supports are firing money in left, right and centre for business to start up. But there's a wee small pot, which is like a small drip that would be helping co-ops, which is very small. And my advice would be, if you're going to set up a worker co-op, is yes, contact Tiziana or Trademark, but keep lobbying for education, keep fighting for education, because very few people know that they actually exist in this country, and that's what we need. We need it out there and in the open. But well done, Ellie, on getting this far.
Thanks, Alice. I hope it did. I hope it showed the cleaning co-op in a positive way as well for those who didn't know about it. And I think actually the cleaning co-op, to respond to Klaus' question, is a bit, it has been supported in a way by part of the trade union movement. So there is a potential symbiotic relationship that you would expect here between worker cooperatives and trade unions. But in the UK and in Ireland, you don't find that. It's not. So, I mean, being French, this is something that I was quite surprised with when I moved to the UK. And it's simply that in France, the trade unionists would be asking for, worker takeovers, for worker ownership of the means of production. If it was not possible after industrial trouble to get what you wanted, you would basically transform your company into a worker cooperative. And that was something that, or you would try to get it nationalized otherwise. But this was something that was very important. And you don't have that here. Now, there are cultural reasons for it, and for the way the cooperative movement developed in the 19th century and for the way the trade union movement developed in 19th centuries. And I think they went really much in opposite ways. And it's also the fact that in the UK in particular, you find a lot of consumer cooperatives. In Ireland, you find a lot of credit unions and agricultural cooperatives. So that didn't really appeal to the trade union as much as in France or in Italy or in Spain, where you had a lot more worker cooperatives. I think, and the worker cooperatives I have talked to, they all want to work with the trade union movement. After all, if you believe in democracy in the workplace, whether it's indirect through trade unions, you're going to believe in direct democracy in the workplace through worker cooperatives. So I think there's very much an attention for worker cooperatives to try and put the message out there and work more with trade unions. I'm not sure trade unions are as interested, and I don't think they necessarily have developed that capacity to help, to help people, especially in worker cooperative conversions, which I know Andrew would probably talk a lot more about. So I think there's a difficulty here. There's expertise that is lacking in the UK and in Ireland that makes this difficult, but there could be such a, it just makes sense that there could be such a symbiotic relationship between the two, that it's really a pity in a way, it's a missed opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, I think that was an interesting answer. So we go to the next questioners. Shiza, would you like to ask you? And then Aidan, just to read out your question. I saw it in the chat, but read it out. We'd like to hear your voice. Shiza, please.
Hi, thank you so much for a great session, Ellie. That was really, really helpful. Just following on from William's question around volunteer contributions. I know that in the US, they have a patronage system where workers can track the number of hours they're putting into a business, a cooperative, and then they'll be paid through dividends at the end of the year. I'm just wondering what the equivalent would be here, and whether, what your thoughts are on models like those, especially for startups that don't have access to funding and are looking at exploring cooperative models, but don't have the means to pay wages up front, but still want to value the different elements, whether it's voting rights, profit rights, share rights. And yeah, I'm just very new to the different models that are available. So any light you can shine on that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Aidan, would you like to ask your question? Oh, we can't hear you.
Okay, thanks, Tiziana.
No
my question's simple, Ellie. At the start of your presentation, you said that co-ops are more productive, they're more profitable, and that there's several reports or evidence to back this up. Can you tell me more about this evidence, or email it afterwards? It doesn't have to be done now. I'd be very interested in that.
Ellie?
Do you want me to respond here? So, Shiza, thank you so much for the question. I don't know if I can even answer it, because I haven't seen any kind of model like this. And because I think if we were talking about community cooperatives, you could discuss that a lot more, as Tiziana has said. But with worker cooperatives, providing employment is the number one. It's the number one rule, really. So if you're not doing that, you're not really working out.
Can I help you out there a bit, Ellie? Because we have tried, and what the mechanism that we refer to is sweat equity, and sweat equity is really when you're doing those initial hours, especially for startup. And Shiza is quite right to think that it's an appropriate mechanism only for startup. When you don't have a lot of capital, the only capital you put is your own labor. But in order to be fair and equitable to everybody, as you, Ellie, very well kind of have described, you need to keep a record of that. So the best way in holding a register of sweat equity, and then at a later stage, provide a value to that sweat equity, a reimburse in some sort of way. It doesn't need to be monetary value, believe me or not. It can be in products, it can be in other time, it can be in share skills. It can be in as much as you want. But I heard even a bakery in Scotland paying equity or dividends on equity with bread. So guys, the sky is unlimited in the way we want to consider labor. But I think that the main issue is that labor needs to be considered. So no matter how you value it, it needs to be at the center of any kind of workers' cooperative. So yes, the answer is sweat equity is the language that we are using in workers' cooperative. Yes, it can be used startup more than mature business, but and then is how you create the value around that sweat equity. That's very important, Shiza. So think about those things if you want to employ this tool. So Ellie, I didn't want to this is from the development point of view. Thank you.
Can I just say on this, because just to mention this a little bit, obviously, if you consider the cleaning society, the first thing that they did is pay living wage. And that's not to be compromised on if you want. But if you look at creative workers, they will tell you themselves that, they started working out, in their room, doing work here and there, being paid very little. It was not a full-time wage. There was no office, there was none of that. And they put a lot of hours to create that business where they're in a place now where they have an office, they have, they have a living wage, they have regulated hours, so sometimes it takes time. And at the very beginning, you do engage, is when Tiziana has said sweat equity. But there's been, for me in this research, there's a kind of a difficult balance here. And it's just a balancing act that cooperatives engaged in. Because I've also interviewed people who have been homeless, who have been in jail, who have had criminal convictions, very difficult backgrounds. And if you say, is reaching the living wage the most important aspect of the cooperative, they'll say no. Even for them, being paid £2 an hour might make such a difference. Now, it can also lead to being an exploitative model. If it's in the long term, there's problems with that. But I think what it highlights is that wages are one aspect of it. But there's all of that pride, all of that fulfillment, that control. And it's trying to balance the two. And there's a difficulty in cooperatives trying to balance culture of care and trying to balance economic imperatives on the other hand. But I can only describe this as a balancing act. I think that's just the best way. There was a question as well, I think that was about, I'll send all of this, but Virginie Perrotin, for example, I'm sorry, I'm throwing you, French names, but Virginie Perrotin did this research, this comparative research in France, in the UK, and there was another country, I don't know why I'm forgetting it right now, but showing that worker cooperatives are promoting more employment and that they're now smaller. And I think that relates to the idea that we have we have an idea of the economy that's misplaced a lot of the time. The vast majority of our businesses are extremely small, and in Northern Ireland as well, but I think everywhere in those countries. And a lot of those businesses don't provide as much employment as we think they do. When you look at all those corporations that Invest and I has brought to Belfast, there was research that was done that for nearly £1 billion spent, there were only 300 jobs resulted out of it. So there's misconceptions here on how much our views of the dominant economy, our views of corporations, of businesses are actually, they're completely misplaced. And when you look and when you analyze worker cooperatives, that's why you find out that they're better. You find out it's obviously very difficult, as I've said, but you find out that they survive usually longer, they survive better, they put money aside as well for continuing, for the organization to continue surviving instead of distributing it to shareholders in trying to maximize profits. So they are actually better at doing business in some ways. And I'm really happy sharing all of those reports and those international comparative studies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Now, contrary to stereotype, I'm Italian, but I like to be punctual. So it's 1 o'clock, and can we go to Andrew? Andrew very nicely joining us. I guess, Andrew, you want me to make you the host? Yeah.
Great.
Let me find your name a bit. Yeah. there are more opportunity to ask questions to Ellie and everybody. So I'm sorry if I didn't take all the questions. I just would like to carry on our conversation. It's a great debate. So, and now I welcome Andrew Harrison from Co-ownership Solution. Here you are, Andrew. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I have been here listening intently. I've had my camera and my microphone switched off. I've been trying to get my AirPods to work for the last 45 minutes and I've given up. I apologise in advance if you can hear what sounds like an earthquake at any stage in the background. We're in the midst of having a kitchen fitted, which should have been done last week and didn't, hence why sadly they're here doing it now. I've also been listening quite intently because I've been interested in what Ellie's been talking about in relation to worker cooperatives. And I think I just want to start by making the point that a lot of what I'm going to cover today is actually about the model of employee ownership rather than specifically worker cooperatives. And as I go through this, you'll explain, it will become clear why. What I want to go through today is I want to talk about business succession and employee ownership. And my focus is going to be very much on the transfer of existing businesses rather than the focus on perhaps startup businesses. And part of my logic behind that is that's ultimately what I do. I work with existing businesses to help them become owned by the employees so that the employees have some degree of democratic control over that organisation, and fundamentally they benefit from the success of those organisations. And I guess the reason I do that is because I used to work for a large employee-owned company, and I also work for the Scottish Government to help advise companies on becoming employee-owned, and I also work with businesses in the UK to help them become employee-owned. But I guess to a certain extent, my honest reason for doing it is I'm looking for the best bang for my buck, as it were. I'm trying to do what I possibly can to get more and more owners of businesses, or sorry, more employees as owners of businesses. And rightly or wrongly, and I do stress rightly or wrongly, my view is the way that we do that, the way that we help achieve the Co-op UK aim of getting 1 million owners is to start with existing businesses. So businesses, small, medium enterprises, where we've got an existing business, and what we can do is work with a business owner to transfer that business to become employee owned in some way, shape or form. I think it's also probably fair to say a lot of the focus today is going to be about why I think businesses and business owners should look at employee ownership rather than the obvious alternatives to them, which might be a trade sale or a management buyout by way of example. I just want to quickly, very, very briefly touch on my background. I spent 10 years working for what was the third largest employee-owned company in the UK, a company based up in Newcastle upon Tyne, where I still live now. For the last 10 years, I've basically been advising business owners and businesses on transfers to employee ownership. My involvement in relation to worker cooperatives is I've worked with a few worker cooperatives over the years. And I was also the vice chair of Co-op and Community Finance, which some of you may be aware of as an organisation previously, or probably known to a lot of people as ICOF, but a cooperative lending body supporting worker cooperatives and other form of cooperatives across the UK and Northern Ireland. Now I do a lot of work for the Scottish Government through Scottish Enterprise. So there's a framework arrangement in Scotland whereby people like myself are effectively paid to go and advise business owners on the possible business succession opportunities for them. But ultimately it's with a view to trying to get those businesses to choose employee ownership as their succession route rather than potentially selling out. My firm is also a specialist advisor for the Employee Ownership Association, which is the trade body for employee-owned companies across the UK. And some time ago, probably back in 2014, I think it was, I wrote the Simply Buyout Guide for Co-ops UK, which was an attempt to try and again to get people to think about employee ownership as a succession route, but it was done with the slant of looking at worker cooperatives, or at least the principles of worker cooperatives within an employee-owned setting. So without further ado, that's the context. I'm going to jump straight into this. So I think first things first, why is business succession planning so important? Well, for me, this is all about making sure that the economy in different parts of the UK is going to be as protected as it can be. So I have to be honest to say, I don't have a great deal of knowledge about Northern Ireland, but from what I looked at over the last couple of weeks, there's around 124,000 private businesses in Northern Ireland. And my question to people in Northern Ireland would be the same question I pose to people in Scotland. What happens when business owners consider their exit? If they don't do something which allows the company to remain in Northern Ireland, i.e. be rooted there because it's owned by the employees potentially, then you have the risk of capital flight, and you have to then consider what the long-term impact, economic impact even for Northern Ireland might well be. One of the things that I've typically found over the last 10 years, and what we find very much in Scotland, and I expect it will probably be quite similar in Northern Ireland, is that lots of business owners don't actually think about succession. The reality is, if for most of them, it will probably represent the one and only opportunity for them to be able to realise the value they've built up over the years. But typically what happens is they don't make planned, informed decisions, and ultimately they end up in a situation where they make ill-informed decisions potentially, rush decisions potentially, and quite often not necessarily decisions which are actually for the benefit of the company or its future. Because I'm in the position where I get to speak to lots of owners about why they haven't thought about business succession, the responses I've typically had from people is that people have got years to work, they're resistant to the idea of actually letting go. There's lots of people that are actually fearful of retirement. They know people that have retired and then drop dead 3 or 4 weeks later. They don't like the idea of that. For some businesses, they've realized that they haven't actually got a successor within the business. So they've got a good, viable business, but they haven't actually made sure they've developed people around them that can take the business on and lead it. In lots of family businesses, the idea of business succession becomes incredibly emotional and complex. So you have somebody that thinks that they've been lined up to be the successor in the business, to then be disappointed to find out actually the owner's got other ideas. So it can be incredibly complex and emotional for people. And one of the bits of feedback that I've often had is people are so busy in the business, they don't actually have that opportunity to navel gaze, to be able to sit back and think about what do I do in terms of planning for the future. I think it's important as I go through this just to set some background to the types of discussions that I have, because again, I'm looking at existing businesses. So I'm looking at a business owned by somebody, and that owner will typically have the option of choosing something other than employee ownership. And to a certain extent, I need to understand their thought process and mindset in order to be able to advise them and hopefully be able to convince them that employee ownership might be a good idea. So there's a couple of things that I have to look at, and I'm going to start with 2 of them: valuation of business and tax. So one of the things that I always have to look at with business owners is the valuation of their business. And I have to say, there is no doubt about it that it's more of an art than it is a science. Ultimately, in any business situation where there's a transfer of a business, we need to have a willing seller and a willing buyer. And quite often, the seller's perspective of the value of their business might not necessarily match with mine or that of the employees. And the issue with this is not some kind of scientific approach where we can use some data and we can spit out an answer at the end of it. It will always be very subjective what somebody thinks a business is worth. And fundamentally, we can't force a seller to sell their business. So what we normally will look to do when we're looking to talk to an owner about selling the business is look at a series of accounts and try and determine what we think a likely value of the business might be. And the typical way of approaching that will be to look at the balance sheet to see what the net asset value of the business might be, or to look at the profits of the company over previous years, or indeed sometimes looking at the turnover of the business, but look to try and determine what we think the likely value of the business is. The reason that we're doing this is ultimately, if the employees are going to own the business, they've got to find a way of being able to fund that valuation. And what we need to do is make sure that we're not actually creating a scenario where the purchase of the business is going to be completely unaffordable. And also, in the context of a trust buying the company, we need the trustees to be able to show that they haven't paid any more than market value for the business. Sadly, one of the discussions that always happens is a discussion around tax. Any person that owns a business will at some stage talk to me, or they will be talked to by their accountant or their solicitor about the tax implications of them selling their company. So in simple terms, when somebody sells shares in a company, there will be a disposal of a capital asset, and assuming that the proceeds from the sale are more than they paid to acquire the shares in the first place, there will be a capital gain on the disposal. And that capital gain will typically be taxed at a level of either 20% or 10%, possibly going to change in March 2021. And what most business owners historically have been able to rely on is the ability to have their gain taxed at a flat rate of 10% because of a relief called entrepreneur's relief. The entrepreneur's relief is essentially a way of being able to ensure that the gain is taxed at a flat rate of 10%. And historically, business owners were able to sell the company, make a gain of up to £10 million, and all of that gain would only be subject to a 10% tax charge. The entrepreneur's relief was adjusted in March 2020 and was reduced from a lifetime limit of 10 million to £1 million. There are conditions that need to be met in order for people to qualify for entrepreneur's relief. An owner has to own more than 5% of the issued shares. They have to have the associated voting rights, and they need to be a director, employee, or an officer of that company. And the gain basically crystallizes at the date that they dispose of the shares, not when the funds are received. The reason I'm mentioning this about tax is when I talk through in a second about employee ownership and employee ownership trusts, there is a mechanism and an incentive whereby a seller selling to an employee trust will not pay any tax. So for me, being able to determine the level of taxation that a seller might pay if they were to sell to a trade seller or a management buyout, for instance, against what they would then pay to an employee trust, zero, it's important for me to be able to work that out. And it becomes a very, very potentially important incentive to get owners to consider employee ownership other than the alternatives. Typically, when I sit down with an owner, the discussion that I'm having with them is to say, these are the normal business succession options that you can choose. There isn't a right or wrong answer. And what they have to do is they have to think about what they want to do. Ellie made a comment earlier in her session about the laws in places like France and Italy. I think in France, it might be called the Marcona legislation, which essentially says on a business being sold, the employees have a right to be able to acquire the business. It would be lovely to see something like that take place in the UK. I have to be honest and say, having worked in this sector for quite a long time, I am desperately, desperately cynical, and I do not believe there is any real government intent to make any such changes as that. There may well be legislative changes which would mean on an insolvency that employee ownership might be an option that has to be considered. But I honestly think the prospect of a business owner coming to sell their business, being forced to give the employees the first opportunity to be able to buy the business, I just honestly do not think will happen. I may be wrong and I may be being desperately, desperately cynical, but that's my position. Normally, when I talk to business owners, the options that we talk through are what I would deem as being the obvious and usual business succession options. So I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list here, but typically the options available to people would be a transfer of ownership to another family member. So essentially a family business stays within the business. It could be that there's a sale to a fellow shareholder. It might be that there's a disposal of a business through a trade sale. It could be that there's a disposal through a management buyout. Hopefully not, but there are situations where the business has to just shut the doors because there is no realistically feasible way of the business continuing. And more, there is a disposal of the business through an employee buyout. And I've put at the bottom here about knowing your enemy. All I really mean by that is I need to understand what the advantages and disadvantages of these respective other business succession options are in order to be able to try and see if there's a hook that I might be able to tie in to get a business owner to realize that actually employee ownership is the better option. I'm not going to go through all of these. I want to go through a trade sale and a management buyout in a second. The reason I don't want to go through family transfer or sale to fellow shareholders is because fundamentally there is no change really of the company there. All that's happening is it's either going to go to another shareholder who at some stage will have to consider these options, or it's going to family members who may do another transfer to the next generation of family, or may then be faced with these same business succession solutions. I will make one quick comment about family transfers, which is if you look at the statistics of family transfers, only around about 30% of businesses make it to the second generation of family business, and only around about 9% of businesses make it to the third generation of family businesses. So typically at some stage, a family-owned business will have to consider one of these alternative options. So I'm going to go on to a trade sale. A trade sale is typically the business succession option that most business owners will know about. So it's an incredibly well-trodden path. There's a huge amount of advice available from accountants and solicitors about how you go about doing a trade sale. There will be lots of business selling agents that will promise they can sell a company if the owner wants to pass £20,000 for a marketing brochure and then pay them a couple of percentage of the sale proceeds. And typically the reason that people will look for a trade sale is because it often represents the best possible opportunity to maximize the value of the business. So normally you'd be looking to sell it perhaps to a competitor or somebody with a complementary business. There would be an incentive for the business owner to get the business in the best possible shape. And all I really mean by that is maximizing the profitability of the company, because typically a trade sale will be predicated on a value based on a multiple of the income. From the owner's perspective, once they've sold the business, it's no longer their concern. They can walk away, sail off into the sunset. The money will hopefully be in their bank account. But if the business goes wrong at some stage in the future, it's not their problem. In most circumstances, somebody looking to do a trade sale will typically expect to take the bulk of the sale consideration on day one. They may not get 100% of the sale value. There may well be some kind of earn-out provision, but they would typically expect to get close to around about 80% of the value, with the rest of that value then being based on some kind of earn-out kind of provision. It may well be that a trade sale is actually a really good prospect for a company. And it might be a really good prospect because the acquiring company may have lots of resources. They may have geographical scope for that business to grow into areas it hasn't gone into before. There might be opportunities for it to grow into different sectors and markets. It might be a really good opportunity for the employees of the acquired company because they've now got progression route within that wider group. That said, I also think there are a vast number of huge disadvantages potentially for trade sales. And they tend to be that the reality is the only person that's being looked after here is going to be the owner of the business. There's no guarantee that there's going to be continuing employment for the employees. Now, there's a risk that if the business is bought out and its assets stripped, it may well be that that economy then loses an employer in the area, and it may well be that there isn't another opportunity for the employees to get gainful employment in that local area. From the owner's perspective, there are a series of potential disadvantages, and they typically tend to be that nobody ideally wants to have to go through the process of due diligence, of sharing the books with the acquirer. If they do share the books with an acquirer, they can get them to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which in theory should keep all of the information about the company confidential. But the reality is once a potential acquirer has been able to look through the books, they will have valuable information about the company. Typically, what I've seen as well is the whole purpose behind the due diligence process is in theory to understand where the bodies are buried within the business. But actually, typically what tends to happen is it's an opportunity then to try to chip away at the price, or to put some kinds of warranties in, or put some kind of earn-out provision in place so that the acquirer is essentially mitigating their potential risk, not necessarily for the benefit of the owner. One of the continual pieces of feedback I get from people that have gone through the process of a trade sale is the one thing that they absolutely hated was they ended up working an earn-out provision. So essentially they spent the twilight years of their working life working for an owner that wasn't them. So they'd been used to running the business in the way that they wanted, not answerable to anybody, and then they find themselves in a scenario where actually they've now got a boss, which is not necessarily what they wanted. If we quickly look at a management buyout, one of the benefits of a management buyout is there's fundamentally no change to the company. So the company stays with the same employees, customers, and suppliers. The owner can typically get market value for the business. They would typically expect to take the bulk of consideration at the point of sale, and there's likely to be very, very limited due diligence. The problem, in my opinion, is that ultimately the management buyout team at some stage need to exit the business. The reality is the wealth that's generated will then typically go to a small group of people rather than to all of the employees that have helped the company be successful. And very, very often there will be a debt burden that's placed across the business. So it will mean that the business's ability to grow may well be curtailed by the fact that it actually already owes people. I am going to go on to the difference about why employee ownership should be chosen as a succession route. But before I do that, I just want to make some distinctions between a workers' cooperative and an employee-owned company. Within a workers' cooperative, you would expect that the individual members would own a share in the company or shares in the company. That requires that there is some degree of investment from the employee. That can often be as little as £1, for instance. But there's a fundamental difference with an employee trust, where no employee of an employee trust-owned company becomes a shareholder or a member. Instead, the employees become beneficiaries of that trust. With a workers' cooperative, as a member, I have the right to vote on all matters that affect the company, and that voting mechanism would be on a one-person, one-vote basis. With an employee ownership trust-owned company, the employees are able to influence the business through trustees or through representatives, but they have no formal right to vote on any of the matters that affect the company because they're not shareholders. With a workers' cooperative, if I'm a member, I have the right to share in the profits. Now, the rules of that specific cooperative will determine whether that's going to be linked to the level of contribution that I make, or whether it's going to be some kind of equal level of distribution. But at least I've got a fundamental right as a member of that workers' cooperative. With an employee ownership trust-owned company, I am an employee, I am a beneficiary of the trust. I have no formal right as a shareholder to share in the profits, but because the company is owned by an employee trust, I have a right to share in the profits indirectly through the employee trust. Within a workers' cooperative, there is in theory the possibility for capital appreciation, although I expect if you look at most worker cooperatives, that's not typically the purpose behind why a workers' cooperative would be established. Within an employee-owned company, because I am not a shareholder, I'm a beneficiary of the trust. When I leave the company, I don't have anything that I can cash in. So if the value of that company I've worked for has grown tenfold over the period I've been there, I don't get any capital appreciation. It's not a possibility because I'm not a shareholder. With a workers' cooperative, there is democratic control. Although there is a principle behind allowing for new members, ultimately it's the members that decide whether or not a new person is going to be admitted as a member. With an employee-owned company, there isn't that same level of control by the employee owners in their capacity as beneficiaries. It's the board ultimately that determine what happens with the company and what the recruitment process might be and who does or doesn't join the organisation. With a workers' cooperative, I would argue that participatory management is arguably the purpose of the organisation. People with a common perspective on things wanting to operate in a very democratic way. With an employee-owned company, I would argue that participatory management is a feature, and it's undoubtedly something that you would want to see within an employee-owned company, but is not necessarily that same level of direct control that you might find in a workers' cooperative. With a workers' cooperative, an existing business, for argument's sake, deciding it wants to become a workers' cooperative, there are no tax incentives. There is no tax incentive for an owner of a business to decide to transfer the ownership to some kind of worker cooperative model. And there's also not any major tax benefits for employee members of a workers' cooperative. With an employee ownership trust, if an owner of a business sells to an employee ownership trust, there are very attractive tax incentives for them, and there are also very attractive tax incentives for owners of employee-owned businesses. It's because of this final point, ultimately, in my view, why I spend so much time working on employee ownership trust models rather than worker cooperatives. There was a piece of work done back in 2012 by Graham Nuttall, who was asked by government, or the coalition government back then, to look at what the obstacles were for companies choosing employee ownership. And the basic conclusions were government knew nothing about employee ownership, professional advisors knew nothing about employee ownership, therefore business owners knew nothing about employee ownership. And what the government decided to do was to redress this was to introduce a series of tax incentives. Rightly or wrongly, the co-op sector didn't really participate in this, and they certainly didn't do enough to make sure that there was an ability for an owner to decide to create a workers' cooperative where you've got democratic control in the way that you'd expect from a workers' cooperative in order for them to benefit from the tax incentives. So this is not meant in any way to be critical of the co-op sector, but my view is the co-op sector, to a certain extent, has been left on the sidelines by not participating more fully in the consultation and in the drafting of the legislation back in 2014. As a result of that, if I go and talk to an owner about the different models of employee ownership and they ask me about workers' cooperative, I will very happily talk to them about how a workers' cooperative can operate. But then when I start to talk to them about the tax implications, I've got no other choice other than talk about employee ownership trusts. The Simply Buyout Guide that I did in 2014 was drafted in such a way where we were trying to encourage employee ownership trusts to be drafted with a workers' cooperative feel and ideology behind it. The reality is even if a company wants to operate in that kind of way, it will be nothing other than a fudge, because ultimately an employee ownership trust has to be able to vote the shares that it holds, and there's no mechanism to allow the employees to physically have a legally binding vote on any matters that might affect the shareholders. So I'll come back onto some of these points as we go through, but I just want to go back now again to employee ownership as a business succession option. When I go and talk to owners, the key point I'm making to them is they can secure a fair price for selling to the employee trust. That may not be the premium that they'd get from a trade sale, but when you factor in that they will pay zero capital gains tax subject to the conditions being met, it means that an employee ownership trust will often equalise to the value they might get from a trade sale. There is very limited due diligence on the basis the employees understand the business. The business itself is not changing, it's just the ownership. So there's a huge amount of continuity. The name above the door can remain. The owner can still retain a stake and retain a role if they want, and there shouldn't be any negative impact on the local economy. This is why the Scottish Government is so keen on employee ownership and has been looking to fund a programme on employee ownership for getting on for around about 12 years now, because they know this roots companies in Scotland. The downsides of employee ownership are typically that the payment that the owner is going to receive will normally be through future profits of the company. So it means the payment will typically be spread over a number of years. It may well be that the type of company is one where there are not physical assets. There's no land and buildings, there's no plant and machinery. So it means that there is little in the way of security for that IOU that's been given to the owner. It might be that one of the challenges the business faces is they don't have the skills and experiences amongst the employee base to be able to make all of the decisions that the owner previously made. So there might be some leadership succession issues that might need to be dealt with there. There's a degree of smoke and mirrors that goes on in terms of the funding and where the debt burden is of employee ownership. But the reality is there will often be a debt burden on the business that can impact its ability to grow going forward. And one of the major other points is that if the business has been run on a largely autocratic basis, there will need to be a cultural shift. There will need to be that move toward more of a democratic way and participatory management if the company is going to see the benefits that are associated with employee ownership. In terms of what I mean by employee ownership, and again, I make this distinction against worker cooperatives, we're talking about companies that primarily run for the benefit of the employees as the owners. We want the employees to get the benefits of the success of the company. And that might typically be enhanced terms and conditions, it might be profit share, it might be participatory management. What we end up with, though, is a company that is no longer run for a single shareholder or outside shareholders. It runs for the people that contribute to its success. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is allow the employees to know that their long-term future is secured because there's no reason for this company to be sold again in the future. There are a large number of employee-owned companies. When I say large, you have to put this in the context of there's 5.7 million businesses in the UK. And at the moment, employee-owned companies probably account for somewhere in the region of around about 1,200. So I say there's a lot of employee-owned companies based on, I've worked in this sector for 20 years and I can remember where the number of employee-owned companies, we'd have probably struggled to have filled the back room of a pub. Now, when we hold an annual conference for employee-owned companies, we get around about 800 people. If I pick out a couple of the companies that people will know of, the John Lewis Partnership and Arup are examples of employee-owned companies that a lot of people will be aware of. Aardman Animations, the people that did Wallace and Gromit, they're an employee-owned company. There are some smaller companies. West Highland Free Press on the Isle of Skye is 10 people with an employee-owned company. There are forms of employee ownership which are arguably more in line with what you might see as being a workers' cooperative. Gripple is a company based in Sheffield that manufactures little metal widgets for wire tensioning. They've got about 650 employees and every single employee is actually a direct shareholder there. They're what we call a direct version of employee ownership. They were set up around about 20 years ago now because the owner didn't like the idea of a trust because he wanted every single individual to physically own a stake in the business and get the benefit of dividends and capital appreciation. The reality is, though, the vast majority of employee-owned companies will tend to be trust-owned companies. And I go back to the reason for that being because the government enacted legislation around about 6 years ago now, which encouraged business owners to choose that model of ownership rather than something else. There was a question asked earlier about the statistics around the growth of employee ownership and why it is that employee-owned companies are more productive and more profitable. If you look at the Employee Ownership Association's website, that's the employeeownershipassociation.co.uk, you will find a series of reports that they've published which look at the business case for employee ownership. And all of those reports will continually conclude that employee-owned companies are more productive, more profitable, deliver a better customer experience, deal better through economic downturns than non-employee-owned companies, and have far more examples of entrepreneurial spirit. I think the only thing I can say at the moment is we've obviously gone through an incredibly torrid last 6 months with COVID. I work with lots of businesses that are employee-owned that have struggled through that period. And for me, the one difference between them and non-employee-owned companies is they are very, very reluctant to take a knife to the employee base and look to cut employee numbers. They will do everything they possibly can to keep people gainfully employed. That might be as a result of pay freezes. It might be as a result of actually people having to take reductions in pay. It might be the management team taking a reduction in pay, but the bulk of those companies that I've worked with are managing to continue and will continue, and they've been able to use employee ownership ultimately as the glue that's kept everybody together. In terms of the model of ownership, essentially what we look to do with an employee ownership trust model is we create this thing called a trust. The trust acquires the shares from the selling shareholder. The shares are then held by this employee trust for the employees of the company now and in the future. And because none of the individual employees physically owns a share, when employees leave, none of the shares are sold. Therefore, there is no reason for the employee trust to ever sell its shares. And this should mean that there is no reason why the company cannot remain owned by the employees for as long as it's feasible, commercially viable and feasible. All of the existing and future, all of the current employees and future employees are beneficiaries of the trust. So there's nothing I need to do. I automatically become a beneficiary of the employee trust the day I join the company. The day I leave the company, I still meet the definition of a beneficiary. It's just that typically the company will make a decision that it only wants to benefit the existing employees of the company rather than people that have left. That's not always the case. And if you ever get the chance to go and look at what John Lewis and Waitrose do for their ex-employee owners, they still provide them with a whole host of benefits. From a tangible perspective, you would probably argue that what you get from employee ownership in this model is you have the ability to receive bonuses. Those bonuses ultimately are your right to share in the profits of the company as an owner of the business. In a non-tangible sense, what you get is hopefully the ability to influence what the company does through some degree of employee representation. Now, the one thing I would stress there is that's not necessarily as direct control in the same way that you might get through a workers' cooperative. The idea here is that the employees have got a voice, and it's very important for the model put in place to ensure that the employees have a voice, but it's not necessarily that same level of democratic control that you might find in a workers' cooperative. To my mind, one of the major benefits of this model is you do not need the employees to put any money in order for this to happen. And if I just make a quick comparison, if we wanted to create a workers' cooperative of an existing business, and the value of that business was, let's say, £1 million, and we'd got 10 employees, in theory, you either need each employee to put in 100,000, or you need to borrow money, and you potentially have to have those 10 people look to give some degree of personal guarantee. In this model, the owner will typically expect to get their money paid to them over future years through profits of the company, or if money is borrowed, that money is secured against the company, and you wouldn't expect any individuals to give any level of personal guarantee. Realistically, in order for any employee-owned company to succeed, what we need is the employees to buy into the idea of what employee ownership gives. And what we want, if they're not going to give any financial investment, is we need that investment in the sense of their passion, their ideas, and them wanting to work collaboratively for the benefit of the company. If I go on to how an employee-owned company is typically run from an operational perspective and from, I guess, a hierarchical perspective, the owners of the business are the trustees of the employee trust. The trustees have got a duty to hold the board of directors accountable for how they run the company. And that's typically a mixture of things like, is the business running well financially? Is it running well operationally? And just as importantly, what is the company doing to develop a culture whereby the employees of the company genuinely believe that they can feel and think and act like owners because they are owners of the business? The board of the company will be the body responsible for setting the strategy, working with the senior management team to translate that strategy into operational practices, and the employees will be the people that put those operational practices into existence. It's really important that the employees have a voice in this structure, and that can be done in different ways. Larger companies may have representatives on the employee trust, they may have representatives on the board of the trading company, and they may also have an employee ownership council. So essentially a vehicle to make sure that there is communication between the board and the employee base. Different companies will approach this in different ways. And if there is a potential downside of employee ownership, it's that there is no legislative framework that says an employee-owned company has to have employee representatives. So in theory, it will be quite possible for me to set up an employee-owned company or at least transfer an existing company to become employee-owned and have no employee representation whatsoever. Obviously, I wouldn't do that, but the reality is as employee ownership gains more traction and we see the likes of KPMG and other big consulting houses coming into employee ownership, that's where I get fearful about how employee ownership will actually look in the future. But again, the essence of this is we genuinely want the employees to feel as though and actually be able to influence what the company does. One of the major benefits that the government introduced for owners, for employees of employee-owned companies, is the ability to be able to receive an income tax exempt bonus. There are a whole host of eligibility criteria, but in simple terms, employees of an employee-owned company can receive a bonus of up to £3,600 per employee per year, and they don't pay any income tax. They still pay national insurance contributions, and so does the company, but there is no income tax levy. And this is where I go back again to the differences between a workers' cooperative and a company owned by an employee ownership trust. If we want to be able to give people the rewards of their labour, and we want to be able to do this in a very tax effective way, this is where, again, the employee ownership trust model comes out potentially on top. If I summarise what I think the benefits to the employees are, what we're trying to do here is make sure they've got long-term employment. We can preserve the culture of the organisation. We can ensure that employees have got influence over the key decisions the business makes. We can give them a right to profit share. We can potentially also give them some degree of equity if that's desired. We can ensure that over a period of time, the employees are able to have enhanced terms and conditions, assuming commercially the business can control, can fund those things. And I would argue fundamentally what we're trying to do is either directly or indirectly give that block of employees control over their destiny. They will own the company rather than it owned by a third party that may have a completely different view. One of the last things I just want to quickly touch on is I quite often will do what I call a myth busting session with the employees. And all I'm really trying to do here is make them clear about the fact that they are not liable for repaying any of the money that's owed to the sellers. They do not become liable for the debts of the company as a result of being employee owners. They have no liability by virtue of the fact that they're beneficiaries of the employee trust. And there's also no changes to their terms and conditions. I don't have to talk about that as often as I used to, but if you go back probably 4 or 5 years ago, you might recall that when George Osborne was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, they dreamt up this scheme, which was essentially you gave away certain employment rights and the company would give you shares in the company instead. It was a complete anathema to employee ownership, but it was billed for some reason as being some kind of employee ownership scheme. So I spent quite a lot of time for a number of years having to convince people that there was no giving away of their employment rights. And there isn't. Basically, none of the terms and conditions of the employee's employment change in any way, shape or form. And my last point here, and this is not meant to be in any way derogatory, is this is not about creating a socialist utopia. All I really mean by that is if companies want to run like a socialist utopia, they want employees to have complete democratic control. There is no reason why you cannot do that. You can put systems and processes in place. But realistically, what I often find is if I sit down with a business owner and I mention the word cooperative with them, you can see the blood drain from their face. And that's simply because they don't actually understand all of the good things about cooperatives. They look at the headlines in the paper, they reference the loony left, pink and fluffy. They don't actually understand. If you look at really good, well-organized cooperatives, they are incredibly successful. But I have to make the point to them that what we're looking to do here is have a transfer of ownership to the employees via a trust. But in a lot of instances, the actual method of operation of the company may not be that different from how it was previously. So how does this work? Basically, I sit down with an owner, I get them to the point where they like the idea of an employee trust. I have discussions with them about what percentage they're going to sell and what the value of the company is going to be. We look at the affordability of the transaction to make sure that we're not going to laden the company with huge amounts of debt. And we're also going to make sure that the employees can get a bonus throughout the repayment process. We will decide on the way that the value is going to be met. Is it all going to be paid through deferred consideration? Is it going to be paid at completion? Is there going to be any external finance, or is the vendor effectively going to act as the bank? It's possible actually to have some degree of employee investment, although in all honesty, we haven't done a deal structured like that probably for about 6 or 7 years now. There is a negotiation process then in terms of the sale. So we'll be looking to make sure that there are certain protections put in there for the trustee and warranties given by the seller. We'll agree on the management and governance of the company going forward. There's a whole host of legal work that goes on in the background. And then the really important constituent in this is making sure that the employees are absolutely clear about what's happening. From their perspective, there's a great change taking place. The company's going to be taken over and it's going to be run for them, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. So in a lot of instances, what we're trying to do is make sure they're clear about what the benefit to them should be. I'm not going to go into this in any great extent, but in order for the sellers to be able to get a relief from capital gains tax, they've got certain conditions that they've got to reach. And essentially that's that they've got to sell more than half of the issued shares in the company. And they've got to make sure the trust ends up in a position where it becomes the controlling shareholder. The sellers and any of their connected persons, so basically family members, they're not able to benefit then from the trust going forward. It's a condition of the tax relief. I'm going to just finish off with a couple of quick things. The typical mechanism for this is that the company will essentially gift its profits or some of its profits to the employee trust, and the employee trust will use that money effectively then to pay off an IOU that's owed to the seller. And this is essentially how we are funding the transaction. The seller is giving away their future right to dividends, their future right to profits, and ultimately you could argue they are effectively funding their own exit from the business. Assuming the company's got sufficient profits after making those payments to the EOT, we would then expect that there would be profits shared with the employees on the basis if the employees aren't getting any of the profit share, you have to ask what the purpose of this is. There are some risks, and the risks ultimately typically are, can the deferred consideration be met? What level of security is available for the owner? Does the business genuinely believe it can continue to trade at the current levels and maintain its level of margin? And then the last risk potentially is, can we keep making sure that we get good team members to join the organisation? I've always found that employee-owned companies don't struggle to recruit people, and the reason they don't struggle is because people like the idea of being in control of their own destiny. They like working for like-minded people. They like the prospect that they can get a profit share based on their contribution, and they like the knowledge that the company is not going to get sold from under their feet. So my last one, I would always argue that employee ownership is now a proven exit route. It's something that business owners should definitely consider. They should consider it because of the attractive tax reliefs. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but it does mean that in comparison to a trade sale or a management buyout, this will often be a better route for them. There is little in the way of external influence that they need to be worried about. We're not reliant on the bank. We're not reliant on an acquirer being able to source funding. We can fund this through the company's own resources. It's a typically timely and cost-effective transfer of ownership, and more solicitors and accountants and other business advisors are becoming aware of employee ownership. I think my only last comment on that is the fact that it's growing at a rate of knots means that we are getting the likes of KPMG and other consulting houses that are looking at employee ownership, who in my experience from what I've seen them do, don't really care about employee ownership. They certainly wouldn't care about the principles of cooperatives, but because of the amount of scope that they've got, the client base that they've got, they are going to sadly, I think, end up dictating what lots of employee-owned companies look like, and they won't be anything like the level of democracy or involvement that any of us would like to see. Right, I think I've probably rattled on long enough, so I'll take questions if that's okay. I'll stop sharing the screen as well.
Thank you. Would you like to make me back the host as well, Andrew, just in case?
Yeah, if you tell me how to do that, yeah.
If you don't mind.
What?
You just highlight my name and then go down and you have make host.
Okay.
The reason why is that the last time the last speaker left and completely closed down for everybody. So here we are. Thank you very much, Andrew. I love your warning at the end. So if there are any government officials, council official there, please pay attention. The last thing we want to come into this kind of sector is the private sector to make actually more money and be considered the most competent to do so. We are really disagree with that. So please do pay attention, councils, departments, all the bigger of governments. But great presentation. Thank you also for being so candid about the differences between workers and employee-owned business. So here I shut up and then open the floor for questions. Anybody?
Hi, Andrew. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah. Hi, David.
Hi there. I was just wondering if you could send me that PowerPoint. I thought it was excellent.
What I'd do, if it's okay, is I've said to Tiziana that the file size is huge, so I'll send you a link that you can download it from. But you're more than happy to have the presentation. Absolutely fine.
That's
I
great.
also remind people that we have a recorded this session, and I was never so glad that we done it, just because the amount of information both from Ellie and from Andrew will be available there on our website, the recording, but the presentation as well. Andrew, it's an interesting presentation. If there are no questions, I will ask you a couple of questions. So Northern Ireland, you are very, very true. You have described Northern Ireland as a small, medium business environment, and this is actually what the Northern Ireland business sector looks like, is SMEs all around us, and is so much important for not losing the wealth of this island. But we are at the beginning of making this message a bit more heard. Do you have any advice, or how we could, or how did you start in other regions to help people to get more knowledge about the workers' cooperative and employee-owned trust, so that we can inform people a bit more? Any advice?
My simple advice would be is you should speak to Cooperative Development Scotland. Cooperative Development Scotland is basically part of Scottish Enterprise, which is essentially the economic part of Scottish government. And many years ago, I think they realised that employee ownership or worker cooperatives would be a way of rooting companies in the Scottish economy. They weren't really necessarily bothered about the central belt, Edinburgh to Glasgow. They were worried about rural areas where there are only a handful of businesses, and if those businesses close, then you've got no employment in those local areas. So what they wanted to do was two things. They wanted to make owners aware of the need to think about business succession, and then they wanted to be able to present employee ownership as being a way of them being able to exit the business without them needing to worry about external finance, an acquirer for their business, etc., etc. So the approach that they took was to work with the account managers that worked for Scottish Enterprise as business advisors to say, you will have a client base that you will know of that are going to come to a point where they need to think about business succession. What can you do so that we can get in front of them and talk to them about their business succession options, and then hopefully present the idea of employee ownership? Because if we just rely on their accountant or their solicitor to do that, and that accountant or solicitor isn't aware of employee ownership, then it will never get broached. So I honestly think that if I were advising the Northern Ireland government, I would be saying what they should look to do is think about how can we make business owners aware of, one, the need to plan for business succession. And it may be that it's not something that's on their radar for another 5 years, but that will come around quickly. So get them to think about it, and then present employee ownership in a way where it becomes a compelling reason and a compelling alternative to a trade sale or a management buyout. I think what I would say is, if you look at Scotland, Scotland has got a great number of employee-owned companies. It undoubtedly punches above its weight in comparison to the rest of the UK in terms of number of employee-owned companies against number of population. But it's because they've had some really, really good success stories. And I think in Northern Ireland, if you got one or two companies that became employee-owned, you would have business owners that would look at those companies and think, I want to be like that. That company's not that different from me. I like the idea of passing it over to the employees. And you will start to then get, it's the whole idea, I suppose, of the stone gathering moss. The more and more companies that will do it, the more people become aware of it, the more solicitors and accountants then need to know about it, because if they don't, they will then lose their clients to those businesses that do.
Andrew, there are a couple of questions. Can I ask maybe Ali and Nolin both to ask the question, or Ali was a comment?
So I've seen both. Yeah, so I've seen both of those. Take Alice's the
Alice's.
barrier.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Alice's.
So for what it's worth, and this might be unfair, and there are people in the co-op sector that know I've got a strong view on this. I genuinely think that Co-ops UK massively missed the boat when the legislation was being drafted to encourage employee ownership back in 2014. And the people at Co-ops UK know my views on that. John Atherton and others, they know my views. I've made it clear on a number of occasions. The reality is that the Treasury is not now, in my opinion, going to look again at trying to do anything for employee ownership, and they're not going to go back and change any of the legislation so that cooperatives can benefit in the same way that an employee ownership trust might. So if I was a business owner and I was looking now at how I sell my company, and I like the idea of the employees taking it on, it's very, very difficult for me to have any compelling reason to choose a worker cooperative model over an employee ownership trust, because there's no tax benefits for me and there's no tax benefits for the employees. So I think, sadly, I think you are going to see vastly more employee-owned companies than you will worker cooperatives. Co-ops UK did some work with Graham Nuttall, the guy I mentioned earlier that did the investigation into employee ownership, to try to develop a trust deed that would have elements of a worker cooperative within it. And I said earlier about a fudge. Having read that trust deed, I still maintain that it is a fudge. If I'm a member of a worker cooperative, I have a fundamental right to have a say on what that cooperative does. It's only a one-person say, but I've still got a say. With a trust, in order for the trustees to be able to fulfill the terms of the trust deed, they have to be able to vote their shares. And that means that they have to act on behalf of the beneficiaries rather than allow the beneficiaries to actually be able to exercise that democratic control. So I like what Co-ops UK have tried to do. I just personally am not convinced that it necessarily does what they would like it to. And I still think we have a problem there. There was another question, which is, can you move from a trust to a workers cooperative? You could, but the cost implications of doing that and the actual processes you'd have to go would be really, really quite difficult. What I've actually had is there was a workers cooperative in Sheffield that transferred from being a workers cooperative to becoming an employee-owned company. And what we then did is we put some systems and processes in place so that they could still exercise democratic control in the same way as they had under the original worker cooperative model that they put in place. Some of you, I expect the vast majority of you will know of the Edinburgh Bicycle Cooperative, which you would hope by its name is a cooperative. And what I would ask you to do is go and look at Companies House. It's not a cooperative, it's a company owned by an employee trust. I've just seen Aidan's question. Is there any plans by government to change the law to drive employee involvement in the company and make it a legal requirement so as to make companies such as KPMG think twice? The simple answer to that is I don't believe so. No, I think there's been talk when Theresa May was Prime Minister, was talk about having worker representation on company boards, but there's continually been huge pushback on that. And that's not just from people like the CBI or the Federation of Small Business. It's actually also come from the trade unions as well, who are not in favour of it either. And I honestly do not believe there'll be any change. One of the things the Employee Ownership Association has been talking to its specialist advisor body about is this prospect of trying to get the government to enact legislation which would require certain things in order for a company to be a qualifying employee trust. So we've spoken about things like the trust having to have employee representation, potentially having to have independent representation, the value of the company actually having to have been legally valued. So a chartered accountant doing a valuation, for instance. But realistically, we're not at a stage where we are in a position where government is likely to take on any of those things. And to be completely honest, again, I'm being desperately cynical. I do not believe there is any government interest in actually putting more checks and balances in place. I think they take the view that the market will decide. So if KPMG want to go out and advise, then so long as they've got the required qualifications, i.e. they've got a solicitor that can do the work that's necessary, then they won't put any restrictions in place. There's a question from Damien. Is the ability to generate tax incentives to move a traditional company to a co-op or EOT, a Westminster based, can power be lobbied and enhanced for the devolved administration? I can't answer the sort of last bit about that because I'm not really aware of how power transfers from Westminster to the devolved regions.
Can I say that HMRC is not a devolved issue? So this is maybe help you to, we are under Westminster for that.
I've got a prospective client. I years ago, when I used to work for a company in Newcastle, we had a company in Belfast called Heat, a central heating company that we owned. We bought it as an employee-owned company. But I've not been back to Northern Ireland since then, but I'm actually in the process of having a discussion with a firm of architects that want to become an employee-owned company who are based in Belfast. And it's meant that obviously I've had to go away and look at the legislation to make sure that it would apply in Northern Ireland. And we can't see anything that would preclude the employee-owned legislation applying to companies based in Northern Ireland. So we fully expect that hopefully at some stage in early 2021, we will have a company owned by an employee trust.
Thank you very much, Andrew. If there are no other questions for Andrew, there is one very patient David Morrow that wants to ask a question to Ellie, if you don't mind. Can we close that? Andrew, are you happy if we pass the last question to David and so Ellie can answer? David.
Hi, Ellie. Thanks very much for your presentation. Thought it was fantastic. And the same to Andrew. And thank you to Tiziana for setting this up. You said, Ellie, in your presentation that democracy is messy, and it seems it's quite intuitive that it would be, given that there's nobody in charge, no direct control, no autocratic leadership. And I wondered if you could speak about the messiness of democracy with reference to your research, maybe.
Of course. It just makes me think of one of the cooperative, they would say they try authoritarian leadership, and it just, you can't do that in a cooperative. It doesn't work. It's not that they've not tried, but no, I mean, it is messy because I think it's part of the culture that we don't know how to operate democratically. And sometimes I think, workers will say, you might want to actually talk about everything, but it doesn't mean that it's weighted by expertise. So how do you come to make decisions in a business if they are not weighted by expertise, especially if the workers don't share the same skills, if they have very different tasks? So when you have, people who are in the bakery, for example, in one of the cooperative, who decides on that? Can the people who do gardening decide on that? So there's difficulties in terms of how you even organize, or how you run the organization. And that can be messy. It's messy because it's conflictual. And if you're invested in your business, there's always going to be conflict. But you don't shy away from it. You just address it. And that comes, they will say, they can argue with each other till they're blue in the face, or, till the end of the day, but you come back in the next day and you still work with those people. So I don't know if I can develop much more, on this than that, but that's why I think they say that it's messy, but it's also extremely rewarding. And I think some worker cooperatives have said we should have a university to tell us how we actually cooperate. It's not just about learning about cooperatives and saying, these are the cooperatives and the sectors in which they operate. It's also, should we learn how to cooperate? Should we learn how to collaborate? If that makes sense. I had actually, if that answers your question, I had a comment for Andrew on employee ownership. Because you've made a really interesting point, is that if you are converting into work cooperative, you need to buy it out a lot of the time. And all of the mechanisms that you've mentioned in other countries, they are there to help workers buy it out. And I just wanted to make that point. So if you go to France and you see some of the kind of conversions that have happened recently, you mentioned, if a company is £1 million, well, there was a company that was converted, which actually was after an industrial dispute with Unilever. So it's a huge corporation. They decided to buy it out and to turn it into, it's a tea company called Fralib, now Scop Tea. And it did cost more than probably £1 million, but they received €1 million actually in funding, half of it from the region, from the local authorities, but also half of it from the cooperative movement itself. So instead of Cooperatives UK, in France, you have a confederation that supports financially worker buyouts, that gives grants to workers, that also act as a guarantors when there's bank loans. And you have also mechanisms where in the redundancy, you can use some of the redundancy package to buy out that company. So I just wanted to make that point that, obviously there's tax incentives for employee ownership, and it seems to be an easier process, but there could be a potential for worker ownership in that as well.
just to quickly respond to that then, you're absolutely right. One of the things the Scottish Government have looked at is to have a Scottish investment bank where there would be money available for people to draw down. In fairness, it will be debt that they're drawing down, but they were keen to do so. Great timing. They were keen to do so. Nothing has ever happened with that, and the reality is the English and Welsh governments have got no real interest. We had conversations with them some time ago, and they essentially said there is no market failure to address here. What they meant was, you haven't given us any evidence that the banks wouldn't actually provide the funding to do these things. The reality is if you go and speak to the bank, I think you mentioned earlier about the difficulty with doing simple things like setting up bank accounts. God forbid you go and ask them for any money to support an employee buyout, because although they're getting better, it's still incredibly, incredibly painful. In an ideal world, yeah, the government would say, we really think this is a good idea, and what we'll do is we'll create a sympathetic body that will help fund these things. My colleague Norman Watson, who's a partner in my firm who used to run the Wales Co-operative Centre, probably 20 years ago put a paper to government basically saying if you really want employee ownership to take off, you could do it easily by putting a chunk of money into an investment body which would fund employee ownership. I expect that report is still gathering dust somewhere in Bays, but nothing's ever happened with it. But totally agree with you that there are mechanisms rather than just tax incentives, but you need a government to want to do that. And again, I'm sure my cynicism again, I don't believe there's any appetite.
Well, thank you very much. So political will again comes to the fore. We needed to have a debt in order to have and support alternative solutions in our economy. Certainly, we are looking here in Northern Ireland, Andrew and Ellie, and you will be interested to know, to have our own regional and ethical bank, the Northern Mutuals. And we are trying to set up this banking with the cooperative values so that that kind of cash could really be recycled here to do all those things that we would like to be seen doing by government and not yet addressed by them. So, but in say so, I'm just closing the session here with your permission. Can we actually show our appreciation to these two excellent speakers? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you both. I will circulate their addresses, their knowledge to all of you so that we will continue this debate in Northern Ireland. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Tiziana. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.